In the sweltering heat of a Georgia auction house in May 1851, a cotton plantation owner named Thaddeus Granger paid 8 cents for a human being. Not $8. 8 cents, the price of a loaf of bread, a pound of nails, 3 sheets of writing paper. The merchandise was a 10-year-old boy named Samuel, born with achondroplasia, what the cruel world of 1851 called a dwarf. At 3 feet tall with shortened limbs and a disproportionately sized head, Samuel had been marked from birth as defective property. His previous owner had literally given him away to settle a bar tab, and the auctioneer had thrown him in as a joke at the end of a livestock sale. Thaddeus Granger laughed when he made the purchase. He told the crowd he'd bought himself a circus monkey that could pick cotton. The men around him roared with laughter. Samuel stood on the auction block silent, his dark eyes fixed on the man who would be his new master. 18 months later, Thaddeus Granger would die screaming beneath a 2-ton cotton press, his skull crushed to pulp by those same small hands he'd mocked, and the boy who cost 8 cents would vanish into history, until a county coroner's report, hidden for 173 years, revealed the truth about what happened at Granger's mill plantation. This is the story history tried to bury. This is the story of Samuel. To understand Samuel's rage, you must first understand what it meant to be born, different, in the antebellum South. Enslaved people were valued as property based on their labor capacity. A prime field hand could sell for $100 and $500 in 1851. A skilled carpenter or blacksmith might fetch $12. Children were valued based on their potential. A healthy 10-year-old boy might cost $400 to $600. Samuel, with his short stature and curved spine, was deemed worthless from birth. Medical records discovered in the Georgia Historical Society archives reveal that Samuel was born on the Whitfield Plantation in Burke County in 1841. His mother, Grace, was a house servant. The plantation ledger contains a single notation about Samuel's birth: Grace delivered, child deformed, no value. In the brutal economics of slavery, no value was a death sentence. Enslaved infants born with visible disabilities were often left to die from neglect. Plantation owners saw no point in feeding a child who would never produce profitable labor. But Grace kept Samuel alive through sheer determination. She nursed him in secret, hid him during inspections, convinced the overseer that he could still perform light tasks. For 9 years, Samuel survived by making himself invisible. He worked in the plantation house, carrying firewood, cleaning chamber pots. Tasks that kept him away from the fields where his small stature would be most obvious. Testimony later revealed he was exceptionally intelligent. He'd taught himself to read by studying the master's discarded newspapers, a crime punishable by whipping or death. But in 1850, everything changed. The Whitfield plantation fell into debt. The master began selling off assets to pay creditors. Grace was sold first, shipped to a plantation in Alabama, screaming Samuel's name as the wagon carried her away. Samuel tried to run after her. The overseer beat him unconscious with a riding crop. Now alone, Samuel became a problem the plantation needed to solve. He ate food, took up space, provided minimal labor. In March 1851, the overseer told Samuel's master about a traveling trader who specialized in curiosities, enslaved people with unusual physical characteristics who could be exhibited in traveling shows or sold as exotic servants to wealthy northern families. But when the trader saw Samuel, he shook his head. Too common, he said. I've got 3 dwarfs already. Market's flooded. I'll give you $5 for him. But that's charity. The master refused. Instead, he took Samuel to the livestock auction in Augusta, hoping someone might want him for novelty value. When the auctioneer saw Samuel, he laughed and said he'd throw the boy in at the end, as a bonus, with a lot of farm equipment. That's where Thaddeus Granger found him. Granger owned a small, struggling cotton plantation 20 miles outside Augusta. He had 12 enslaved workers, a failing crop, mounting debts, and a reputation for explosive cruelty. When he saw Samuel standing on the auction block, he saw an opportunity. Not for labor, for entertainment. Granger paid his 8 cents and told the crowd, "I'm gonna make this little monkey dance." Granger's mill plantation was a nightmare even by the standards of 1851. The main house was a decaying 2-story structure surrounded by collapsing slave cabins, a cotton gin powered by a dangerous mechanical press, and fields of struggling cotton plants. Thaddeus Granger, a 42-year-old widower with no children, ran the plantation with savage unpredictability. Overseer testimony taken after Granger's death described a man who would work his enslaved laborers for 18 hours straight, then disappear on drinking binges for days. He used a bullwhip with metal tips that left permanent scars. He withheld food as punishment for minor infractions. 2 enslaved people had died on his plantation in the previous year. one from infected wounds, one from heatstroke after being locked in a storage shed for 3 days. When Samuel arrived in June 1851, Granger made his intentions clear. Samuel would not work the fields. He was too small, too weak, too useless. Instead, Granger would keep him as a personal servant, a living toy to amuse guests and provide entertainment during meals. The coroner's investigation later revealed the systematic torture that followed. Granger forced Samuel to perform tricks, standing on his hands, dancing, speaking in exaggerated slave dialect for the amusement of dinner guests. When Samuel moved too slowly or showed defiance, Granger would kick him across the room. When guests weren't present, Granger found darker amusements. He would make Samuel fight the plantation dogs for scraps of food. He would force him to stand outside in the rain for hours, while Granger watched from the porch. He would burn Samuel's hands with cigar tips, then laugh when the boy tried not to cry. But the worst torment was psychological. Granger had learned that Samuel could read, a valuable skill that could have made him useful as a clerk or record keeper. Instead of utilizing this, Granger forbade Samuel from touching books. He would leave newspapers open on tables, then beat Samuel if he caught him looking at them. He told Samuel repeatedly that he was worth less than an animal, that his mother had probably forgotten him, that he would die as worthless as he'd been born. The enslaved community at Granger's mill tried to protect Samuel when they could. A woman named Bessie would save portions of her own meager rations to feed him. A man named Joshua made him a small wooden horse to lift his spirits. But they were powerless to stop Granger's abuse. Any attempt to intervene would result in savage punishment for all involved. For 16 months, Samuel endured. He grew quiet, withdrawn, his eyes empty during the day. But at night, the other enslaved people would sometimes hear him whispering to himself, not prayers, but something else. Bessie later testified that she heard him one night, sitting alone in the dark, repeating the same words over and over. 8 cents, 8 cents, 8 cents. He was calculating his worth, internalizing his value in the only currency his world recognized. And somewhere in that darkness, his mind was breaking, or perhaps sharpening into something far more dangerous. The breaking point came in October 1851, during the cotton harvest. Granger's crop had failed again. Boll weevils and drought had destroyed most of the yield. Desperate to process what little cotton remained, Granger had ordered his enslaved workers to operate the cotton press around the clock. The press was a massive mechanical device. 2 large wooden beams connected to a screw mechanism, capable of compressing loose cotton into dense, shippable bales. It was also one of the most dangerous pieces of equipment on any plantation. The pressure required to compress cotton could easily crush bone. Workers had lost fingers, hands, even arms in cotton press accidents. Safe operation required constant attention, careful positioning, and strict safety protocols. Granger, drunk and furious about his losses, ignored all safety measures. He forced his exhausted workers to load cotton faster, operate the press with less care, take dangerous shortcuts. When Joshua warned him that the press's safety pin was loose, Granger struck him across the face and told him to get back to work. And then on October 17, 1851, Granger made a fatal decision. He ordered Samuel into the press. The official story, the one recorded in the original, falsified plantation records, claimed Thaddeus Granger died in a tragic accident while operating the cotton press. The mechanism had malfunctioned, the safety mechanisms had failed, and he'd been crushed before workers could pull him free. But the true story remained hidden until 2024, when a historian named Dr. Marcus Webb discovered a sealed coroner's report in the basement of the Richmond County Courthouse. The document had been deliberately misfiled and marked confidential, part of a conspiracy to suppress the truth about what really happened. According to eyewitness testimony taken in secret after Granger's death, this is what actually occurred on October 17th at approximately 4:00 p.m. Thaddeus Granger, drunk on whiskey and enraged by his failing harvest, decided that Samuel should learn to earn his 8 cents. He ordered the boy to climb into the cotton press to pack down loose cotton that had jammed the mechanism. This was insanity. The press was partially compressed, held in place only by a loose safety pin that Joshua had warned was faulty. Any sudden movement, any shift in pressure, could cause the mechanism to slip. An adult would have refused, but Samuel was a child, owned property, legally prohibited from disobeying a direct order. Bessie testified that she begged Granger not to do this. He struck her with his walking stick and told her to shut her mouth. Samuel climbed into the press. His small body could fit between the massive wooden beams where an adult couldn't. He began packing down the cotton, his hands working mechanically, his face expressionless. Granger stood beside the press, yelling instructions, taking swigs from his whiskey bottle, and then something changed. The other enslaved workers couldn't say exactly what they saw, but they all agreed on one detail. Samuel stopped moving. He stood perfectly still inside the press, his hands resting on the cotton, his eyes fixed on Granger. Then he spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear, clear as a bell. "Master Granger, sir, could you please check this cotton here? I think it's packed wrong." Granger, annoyed but curious, stumbled over to the press. He leaned in, sticking his head and upper body between the wooden beams to see what Samuel was pointing at. That's when Samuel moved, in one fluid motion, impossibly fast for a child who'd been beaten and starved for 16 months. Samuel reached up and yanked the loose safety pin free from its housing. The metal tooth that had been holding tons of pressure suddenly released. The massive wooden beam dropped like a guillotine. Thaddeus Granger's scream cut off instantly as 2 tons of wood and iron crushed down on his head and shoulders. The sound, witnesses testified, was like a watermelon splitting, a wet, pulpy crack that echoed across the plantation yard. But Samuel wasn't finished. As Granger's body convulsed, his brain stem not yet dead, his nervous system firing random signals, Samuel grabbed the press's crank handle, and he began turning it, slowly, deliberately, adding more pressure, more compression. Witnesses said his face showed no emotion, no rage, no satisfaction, no fear, just concentration, like he was performing a mathematical calculation. 8 cents, he whispered as he turned the crank. 8 cents, 8 cents. He was determining how much pressure 8 cents of human value could generate, how much force a worthless life could produce, how thoroughly a boy could erase the man who'd tried to erase him. By the time Joshua pulled him away, gently, not violently, with something like awe in his movements, Thaddeus Granger's skull had been compressed to less than half its original size. The coroner's report, discovered 173 years later, includes a clinical sketch of the damage. The skull had been crushed so thoroughly that individual bones could no longer be identified. The brain matter had been pressed into the cotton bales, creating a grotesque mixture of fiber and tissue. Samuel stepped out of the press, his clothes covered in blood, and sat down on the ground. He didn't run, didn't hide, didn't speak. He just sat there waiting. What happened next reveals the complex, unspoken codes of the enslaved community, and the desperate lengths white society would go to suppress stories that threatened their narrative of control. The other enslaved workers at Granger's mill faced an impossible decision. If they reported Samuel's action as deliberate murder, he would be executed, likely burned alive or hanged in a public spectacle designed to terrorize other enslaved people. But if they remained silent, they risked being accused of conspiracy, which could result in their own executions. Joshua made the decision. He told everyone to say it was an accident, that Master Granger had been drunk, had foolishly leaned into the press, and that the faulty mechanism everyone had warned him about had finally failed. Samuel had been inside the press at the time, had tried to warn Granger, had even tried to hold the beam back. Look at his hands, bloodied from the effort. The overseer, a man named Pike who secretly despised Granger, saw an opportunity. With Granger dead, the plantation would be sold to pay debts, and Pike might finally escape this miserable posting. He backed the accident story, told the county sheriff that he'd repeatedly warned Granger about the dangerous equipment, that the man's drunkenness had finally caught up with him. But the local coroner, Dr. Ambrose Sterling, wasn't convinced. He examined the scene carefully and noticed several problems. The safety pin hadn't just failed, it had been cleanly removed and tossed several feet away. The cranking mechanism showed signs of having been deliberately turned after the initial compression, and Samuel's hands, while bloody, showed no crush injuries, only surface cuts consistent with handling the safety pin. Dr. Sterling conducted private interviews with the enslaved witnesses, away from Pike's presence. In whispered conversations, several people admitted the truth. The coroner documented everything in his official report, including his conclusion. The deceased's death was caused by deliberate action, likely perpetrated by the child slave Samuel. However, given the extensive evidence of severe abuse and torture inflicted upon said child, and given the deceased's known cruelty and violation of safety protocols, I find this action to constitute justifiable defense of life rather than criminal murder. It was an extraordinary statement for 1851, a white professional official declaring that an enslaved child had justifiably killed his master. But Dr. Sterling knew his finding would never be accepted. Georgia law didn't recognize enslaved people's right to self-defense. The legal code explicitly stated that killing a master was murder regardless of circumstances, so Dr. Sterling made his own decision. He filed 2 reports. The official public report declared Granger's death an accident caused by equipment failure and operator intoxication. The true report, the one discovered in 2024, he sealed in an envelope marked "Confidential Medical Documentation" and hid in the courthouse archives. Then he helped Samuel disappear. The historical record here becomes fragmented, but evidence suggests Dr. Sterling contacted a secret network, likely connected to the Underground Railroad, that specialized in moving dangerous, enslaved people to freedom. Samuel couldn't simply be sold to a new plantation. His involvement in Granger's death, even as an accident, made him too notorious, and executing a child would create martyrdom that could inspire resistance. The solution was erasure. In November 1851, Samuel vanished from all official records. The plantation sale documents listed 11 enslaved workers, not 12. Samuel's name disappeared from county records. It was as if the 8-cent boy had never existed. But oral history, passed down through generations of African American families in Georgia, tells a different story. Multiple family histories reference the child who crushed the devil, or the little boy who made himself tall. Some stories place him in Canada by 1852. Others suggest he remained in the South, living under a new name, protected by communities who understood what he'd done and why. One particularly compelling account comes from the diary of a Quaker schoolteacher in Philadelphia. Discovered in 2019, in an entry dated March 1853, she writes about a new student, a small boy of unusual proportions, who speaks rarely but reads voraciously. He will not discuss his past, but carries himself with a gravity beyond his years. When asked his name, he paused for a long moment before answering Freeman. The diary entry continues. One of the other children asked why he was so short. He replied, very quietly, "Because I was built for tight spaces, to fit where tall men cannot go, to reach what they cannot reach." The other children laughed, but I saw something in his eyes, an old understanding, like he had measured the distance between heaven and hell, and found it to be exactly the width of his small hands. The story of Samuel forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about resistance under slavery. We often prefer narratives of noble, non-violent resistance, slaves who maintained dignity through faith, who escaped through clever subterfuge, who endured until freedom came. But Samuel's story is about a different kind of resistance, the resistance of a child pushed beyond every human limit, the resistance that calculates its own worth in cents and determines that 8 cents of humanity contains more power than a master's entire fortune, the resistance that chooses violence not from rage but from mathematical certainty, the physics of survival. In 2024, when Dr. Marcus Webb discovered the sealed coroner's report, he also found something else in the archives, a plantation ledger from the estate sale of Granger's mill. The enslaved workers were valued and sold to new owners. Bessie sold for $800, Joshua for $100. But there's one entry that stands out. Under the column marked assets disposed of by other means, there's a single line, Dwarf boy Samuel, age 10, value, incalculable. Someone, probably Dr. Sterling, had crossed out 8 cents and written, incalculable, in careful script, a small act of recognition, a tiny amendment to history's ledger. We don't know what happened to Samuel after 1853. We don't know if he lived a long life, if he ever found his mother Grace, if he ever felt safe enough to tell his story. The historical record goes silent, but we know this: on October 17, 1851, a 10-year-old boy declared his own value. He calculated the weight of his worth not in currency but in pressure. And he taught a master the final, fatal lesson, that there is no such thing as worthless human life, only lives that have not yet determined their own price. This is the story of Samuel, the 8-cent boy who became incalculable, the child who fit in tight spaces and reached what others could not reach, the smallest hands that ever brought down the weight of justice. Remember his name, because history tried very hard to make you forget.